In 1972, an aircraft carrying 45 passengers crashed amid towering snow-covered mountains known as the Andes Mountain Range. Some passengers miraculously survived, but now they would face their most challenging task: surviving in the harsh conditions of this place. The cold was bitter, and the conditions were severe. There was no trace of any living creature in this remote location, devoid of all life essentials, with no food sources around them. The small amount of food that had been on the plane ran out, and here they would have to make the hardest decision of their lives to eat each other to survive. The situations and circumstances that the passengers would go through would be harder than anything imaginable, yet they would continue to struggle and cling to the rope of survival. Would they survive in the end, or would this be their final journey? Our story begins in October 1972. The protagonists are a rugby team from Uruguay, rugby being a sport somewhat similar to American football. This team consisted of amateurs, most of them university students in their early 20s. The team was from Uruguay, which, for those who don't know, is one of the South American countries. This team was invited to a match in Chile, another South American country. As you can see on the map before you, they're in Uruguay and will cross all this distance to Chile, meaning they'll fly over Argentina. Keep this flight path in mind as it's important to the story. The trip was supposed to be a short one. Lasting just 4 days, they would leave on Thursday and return on Monday. The next step was finding an airplane to charter at a cheap or reasonable price, as they were young and didn't have much money. Their choice fell on this aircraft you see before you, which carried the number 571, a medium-sized plane that could accommodate about 50 people. After the team sent their passenger list to the plane's captain, he informed them that there was room for 10 additional people on the plane, so they could bring others if they wanted. Some team members decided to bring their families along. In the end, the total number of passengers reached 45, including the pilot, co-pilot, and crew. This young man you see here is named Nando Parado, and he was one of the team members. Keep this person in mind, as he will play a major role in the story. We might even consider him the main character. Nando was one of those who brought family members when he heard there was space on the plane and empty seats. He decided to bring his mother and sister along, immediately calling them to say they would go with him to Chile. Nando thought he was taking them on an enjoyable trip where they would have fun together. He would show them around Chile, take them shopping, and pamper them. It was like a gift he was giving them with all his love. He had no idea that what awaited them would be worse than anything he could imagine. Their journey began on Thursday, October 12, 1972. As you can see on the map, they departed from Uruguay, specifically from the city of Montevideo, with their destination being Santiago, Chile. But if you notice here on the map, this white color represents a mountain range called the Andes Towering Mountains, extending over long distances, the highest mountains in all of South America. Of course, the white color represents snow because at these altitudes, everything is frozen. The plane was supposed to cross over these mountains, but due to weather conditions that day, the pilot decided to land in Mendoza, Argentina, which lies directly before the Andes Mountains. They spent that night in Argentina. The next morning, which was Friday, October 13, they decided to continue the journey. By the way, in Western culture, when Friday falls on the 13th of the month, many consider it very bad luck or a bad day. Although neither the pilot nor the team members were thinking about this at the time, truly the worst thing in their lives would happen on that specific day. What made matters worse was that the aircraft they were flying in was considered one of the worst in terms of design. This plane, called the Fairchild FH-227, had a terrible engine design to the extent that 1/3 of planes of this specific type had accidents 1/3 because the plane's engines were considered too weak for its weight. Of course, they didn't know this at the time, or they probably wouldn't have boarded this plane in the first place. But the accident that would happen to them was caused more by pilot error than the plane itself, though the plane and its weak engines played a role. The team boarded the plane, and the journey began again on Friday, October 13. Let's return to the map. They're currently in Mendoza, Argentina, and need to fly to Santiago, Chile, but crossing over the Andes Mountains would be a huge risk, especially since weather conditions weren't at their best, and also because the plane's engines, as we mentioned, weren't that powerful. They would need to fly at a very high altitude to cross these towering mountains. So the pilot decided he would head south, and at the end of the Andes mountain range, would turn west and cross the mountains through a lower pass, meaning he wouldn't have to fly at high altitudes. After that, they would pass through a city called Curacao, and from there to their final destination, Santiago. The team on board was happy and their spirits were high. They were playing, singing, and in a great mood, not carrying any worries. Remember Nando, whom I mentioned earlier? Nando was sitting next to the window, and in the seat next to him was his friend named Panchito Abal. Of course, many people prefer to sit by the window to see the weather and views outside. So this friend said to him, "Brother, you've been sitting by the window since the beginning of the trip. Switch with me." And Nando said, Okay, come on," and indeed gave him the window seat. This moment, despite being very ordinary at the time, would determine which of them would live and which would say goodbye. Back to the flight path, the plane reached the southern end of the Andes Mountains, and now the pilot turned westward, heading toward Curacao. The plane was supposed to arrive in Curacao at 3:33 p.m., but the pilot communicated with Santiago Airport informing them they were currently over Curacao at 3:25 p.m., meaning their arrival at Curacao was early by about 8 minutes. To understand just how grave this error was, focus with me this distance marked in red that the plane was supposed to cross at the southern end of the Andes mountain range was supposed to take them about 11 minutes. But when the pilot communicated with the airport saying they were currently over Curacao, only 3 minutes had passed since their westward turn, which means the plane hadn't reached Curacao but was still over the Andes Mountains. When the pilot thought he was over Curacao City, he turned north, believing he was heading towards Santiago. In reality, he had turned into the Andes Mountains and was penetrating deeper northward. Visibility was poor. The height and terrain of the Andes created weather conditions and storms that made visibility extremely difficult in this area, making it hard for the pilot to determine his position through visual observation. They were above the clouds, but the strange thing was how he could believe he had covered all this distance in just 3 minutes. This was the fatal error he made. Now the pilot was flying the plane above the clouds, unaware that the Andes Mountains were directly below. Of course, the deeper he went into the mountains, the stronger the mountain-caused winds became. The passengers began feeling these air turbulences, and the flight attendant told them to stay in their seats and fasten their seat belts. She told them literally, "The plane will dance a little, so stay in your seats." Everyone thought these were just air pockets that would pass. To reduce the severity of these air turbulences, the pilot and co-pilot decided to descend below the clouds. As we mentioned, they thought they had already passed the mountains, not knowing they were literally descending into the mountains themselves. The clouds and weather conditions in front of them prevented them from seeing the mountains below, and the lower they went, the stronger the winds and air currents became, making the plane shake more. All passengers inside began feeling afraid. As soon as the plane descended below the cloud cover, the pilot and co-pilot were shocked by the towering mountains in front of them. Even the passengers could see mountains around them when they looked out the windows, and here real terror began to grip their hearts as they realized something was terribly wrong. The pilot and co-pilot tried to push the plane's engines to maximum power as they attempted to climb above the mountains. But as we mentioned, this plane's biggest flaw was its weak engines. When you put a plane like this under full pressure, it won't perform well. The plane couldn't climb above the mountains at the required speed. It was literally heading for collision with the mountain. The pilot saw what looked like an opening or small curve in the mountain and decided to try to pass through it, but the plane couldn't climb at the required angle. It struck the mountain, and in an instant, the tail and wings were destroyed. Most of the plane's body disappeared, leaving only the front section. At that moment, several passengers literally flew out with the destroyed parts, especially those who were sitting in the rear of the plane. The front section continued sliding on the snow, with the remaining passengers inside trying to cling to life. The sliding was not smooth at all inside the plane. Seats flew from their positions and crashed into each other, and passengers' bodies were thrown between them. Some died instantly, some were injured, some were thrown out, and some had their legs broken. The situation was tragic. Despite all this, they were actually lucky that the plane hadn't completely destroyed the pilot's final attempt to pass through the mountain's curve, was what saved the plane's front section, and the relatively smooth sliding of this front section on the snow saved many lives. This was amazing in itself. Imagine that the initial crash resulted in only 12 deaths out of the 45 people. This meant that after the crash, there were still 33 people alive, though some of these 33 had severe and critical injuries. The survivors who could still move got out of the plane and began to see their surroundings. The weather was bitter cold, with towering mountains, storms, and snow as far as the eye could see. They were at an altitude of 3,600 meters, and none of them was accustomed to snow at all. Those who were in better condition began helping the injured. The situation was tragic. Some dead, some unconscious, some broken and severely injured. Nando was among those unconscious, and the others weren't even sure if he was alive, so they took his body and placed it at the end of the plane's fuselage, near the outside, to make room for survivors inside who they thought needed it more. As for his mother and sister, his mother was among those who died immediately, while his sister was severely injured. The pilot was also among those who died, as he was in the front of the plane where the impact occurred. The co-pilot was severely injured to the point of taking his last breaths. The survivors tried to talk to the injured co-pilot, but he was in a pitiful state. They knew the only person who could tell them where they were was the co-pilot. He kept telling them they had passed Curacao, the city they thought they had reached. Of course, they hadn't reached it, but when the co-pilot told them they had passed Curacao, they thought they were on the western side of the Andes Mountains. In reality, the plane had crashed on the eastern side of the Andes, the Argentine side. The crash site was so far from any trace of civilization that it didn't even have a name. Later, it would be called the Valley of Tears because of this plane crash and its victims. After telling them they had passed Curacao, the co-pilot couldn't hold on and died shortly after. The survivors tried to use the plane's radio to communicate with any possible responding party, but the radio wasn't working. It had likely been damaged in the crash and impact. The survivors knew they had to adapt quickly to the situation and protect themselves from the harsh conditions. They took out the luggage that was inside the plane to make space inside the fuselage and began taking out clothes. They knew they needed as many clothes as possible to survive in these conditions. The first night was very bad. The plane crash happened around 3:30 p.m., and just half an hour later, at 4 p.m., the sun set. So they immediately faced the bitter night when the cold becomes more severe and harsh. That night, the first night, was the hardest on them. The temperature in these mountains at night reaches -30 degrees below zero. All they could do was gather and huddle together inside the plane's fuselage, trying to warm each other with what remained of their body heat. During the first night, 5 additional people died, including the co-pilot. Some died from their injuries and others from the severe cold. Now 28 people remained alive. The next day, after the sun finally rose, they felt some warmth. Of course, there wasn't real warmth even with the sun out, but at least it was better than the night. The survivors took out the bodies of those who had died during the previous night to make more space for themselves inside the fuselage. The second disaster facing them was food. They had no food. All they had on the plane was some canned sardines, chocolate pieces, and biscuits. They shared these among themselves, but it wasn't enough for anyone to even feel they had eaten anything. Even though they tried to ration very severely what they had, it only lasted them for a few days and nothing more. On the third day, Nando, whom they had almost presumed dead, suddenly began to move. They had placed him at the back of the plane near the exit, exposing his body to the bitter cold with no way to keep warm. Here's something remarkable. According to modern medical specialists, Nando had suffered internal bleeding in his brain, and in contemporary medicine, when someone experiences internal brain injury, the best method to try saving them is to keep them at an extremely low temperature. So what Nando's friends did by placing his body at the rear of the plane's fuselage near the exit was likely what saved his life. The extreme cold protected him from the internal brain injury he had sustained. All of this happened by pure coincidence, without any planning from any of them. It was divine intervention. When Nando started regaining consciousness, he tried to comprehend what was happening around him. His friends called out to him, saying, "Nando, can you hear us? Nando, do you understand us?" As he struggled to grasp the situation, his friends, unfortunately, didn't consider that he had just awakened from a coma and immediately bombarded him with devastating news. They told him the plane had crashed, his mother had died, and his sister was severely injured. Despite his difficult condition, Nando quickly processed everything when he heard about his mother and sister, immediately asking where his sister was. He pointed to her nearby, and it was evident her condition was very critical. Nando moved closer to her, trying to comfort and console her. He surely felt immense guilt at that moment because he was the one who had brought them along. His sister, by the way, was only 17 years old. After regaining his balance, Nando emerged from the plane's fuselage and began surveying their surroundings. He was shocked. There was nothing visible as far as the eye could see except mountain peaks and endless snow. No signs of life, not even animals could survive here. The group was hoping that search and rescue operations were currently underway and that authorities were looking for them. Indeed, 3 countries were participating in the search operations: Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile. This was the designated search area in the Andes Mountains, and the plane was actually within the search zone. However, the problem was that this area was vast, weather conditions were consistently harsh, and moreover, the white plane had crashed onto white snow. Search planes had to fly at very high altitudes above these mountains, making visibility even more difficult. The survivors heard the sounds of search planes flying above them and even glimpsed some from afar. Despite their attempts to attract these planes' attention, no one noticed or could see them. The families of the plane's passengers were holding their breath and on edge while waiting for any news about their children. Some immediately lost hope and felt despair after several days passed without finding them or their plane wreckage. The mere thought that they might have survived the initial crash was crazy enough, let alone surviving for several days in these mountains and freezing cold. It seemed like madness. Many families lost hope, but the players themselves didn't give up and remained hopeful that during these days, surely one of the search and reconnaissance planes would spot them. However, their conditions were worsening each day. Nando always tried to stay by his sister's side and comfort her, but her injuries were too severe to survive. During the 5th or 6th day, she passed away, reducing the number of survivors to 27 people. Days continued to pass, and with each passing day, they lost more hope. They reached the peak of despair on the 10th day. They had a small radio, and one of them had some experience with radio devices, so he managed to create an antenna or aerial. They were able to pick up some radio stations, and through this radio, they could follow news about the search for them. On the 10th day, they heard news on the radio that the search operations for them had been suspended as they couldn't be found. This news stripped away any remaining hope they had. The problem was that hunger had begun to gnaw at them. It had actually been gnawing at them for days, but they had been enduring it hoping they would be rescued. Regarding drinking water, they solved this problem easily. They used metal sheets from the plane's seats, put snow in them, and using sunlight reflection on the metal, they managed to melt the snow into water. So water wasn't an issue, but their real problem was food. The little food they had, sardines, biscuits, and chocolate, had all run out days ago. They had no food source or anything edible left. They even tried eating leather from bags or plastic. These were just desperate attempts. They knew these things weren't edible, but literally had nothing else. This is when the idea that many of them had feared began to emerge, eating the bodies of their dead friends. The idea wasn't just frightening, it was terrifying to all of them. Most of them completely rejected this idea initially, while a few reluctantly accepted it and began trying to convince the others. It was clear there was no other way to survive, either die or eat their friends, with no third option. Some rejected the idea on religious grounds, while others refused because they couldn't stomach the idea of eating human flesh, especially their friends' flesh. A normal person living in normal circumstances could never imagine eating human flesh. But at the same time, a normal person could never imagine the situation of someone who needs to survive with no other way out. It's impossible to put yourself in their shoes unless you're actually in their position. No matter how hard you try to imagine, believe me, you won't be able to. It's impossible to think you would do the things that a person on the brink of death might do. The endurance capacity, way of thinking, and mental and physical state are completely different. Accepting this idea wasn't easy for them, even on the brink of death, but each of them knew there was no other way to survive. Due to the extreme cold, all the bodies were in excellent condition. They hadn't decomposed and wouldn't decompose as if they were living in a freezer. However, they still needed tools to cut the flesh, so they used plastic from the plane's windows to make makeshift knives. Each time they would take small pieces. They weren't making it like a feast. They would sometimes cook the meat, but due to the scarcity of wood, paper, or combustible materials, they rarely could light fires. Most of the time, they even ate this meat raw. They all ate while disgusted with themselves, but when this meat entered their bodies, providing fats and carbohydrates, and their bodies felt nourished and began to feel energy returning, even if slightly, their minds understood this was the only way to survive, no matter how disgusted they were by it. To cope with this better, they made a pact or agreement among themselves that if any of them died, they would allow the others to eat their body. The photos before you are real photos they took with a camera they had, and in some of these photos, we can literally see parts of their friends' bodies on the ground beside them. Of course, I won't show you these photos, but what I want to say is that with time, they began to get used to this. It became part of their daily life in this place, their only food source, literally. Days passed, and they continued in this same rhythm and situation, just trying to hold on to any hope of survival possible. They had no specific goal, just survival, nothing else. They didn't know where they were going or what they would do. If only the difficulties had stopped here. What they didn't know was that a new disaster was about to befall them. The Andes Mountains, due to their height and the amount of snow that falls on them, experience numerous avalanches. The disaster was that the location where the plane's fuselage lay was like a valley, surrounded by mountains from all directions, making it vulnerable to any avalanche that might come from above. Around day 15, weather conditions began to worsen, and heavy snowfalls started in their area. They remained sheltered inside the plane's fuselage and even built a wall using their bags and belongings to cover the fuselage opening. The snow continued to fall heavily for about 3 days. Of course, the more snow accumulated, the higher the chance of avalanches. On the night of day 18, while they were sitting inside the plane's fuselage, they suddenly heard a sound like an explosion. It was thunder. This sound occurs when an avalanche begins because the snow is losing its cohesion. After that, they felt something like trembling in the ground. The ground was shaking as if 1,000 horses were running toward them. In that moment, the avalanche invaded the plane's fuselage, and they were all buried under enormous amounts of snow. The situation turned to chaos in an instant. Some were completely buried under the snow to the point where they couldn't move at all. This is one of the worst ways a person can die. Imagine being buried under snow in this deadly cold, and on top of that, unable to move or even breathe. Some were partially buried but could move a little, so those who could move began trying to free themselves. Some also suffered serious injuries because the force of the avalanche hit them violently, lifted them, and slammed them into the plane's fuselage. Those who could move tried to help the buried and injured ones escape. The situation was extremely difficult, and the disaster was that even those who could get out from under the snow wouldn't find a safe shelter around them. Everything around them was snow, offering no warmth. The entire plane fuselage was buried under snow, and imagine that they remained trapped inside the fuselage for 3 days. So now they were all buried under the snow, but inside the fuselage. The fuselage was the only thing protecting them. Above ground, snowstorms were raging, and they could hear the sound of these storms above their heads from under the snow. Glory be to God. Perhaps the avalanche had turned from a curse to a blessing because it created a barrier protecting them from the mighty storms above. They remained sheltered inside the plane's fuselage, and their only source of warmth was 1 or 2 small lighters. Of course, the situation remained tragic. The avalanche had caused 8 deaths, reducing the number of survivors from 27 to 19 people. But even these 8 deaths were, in a way, a blessing because they provided the others with an additional food source to survive on while simultaneously reducing the consumption of their limited food resources. It's terrifying to talk about death in this way, but this was their reality. First, if these 8 hadn't died, survival would have been difficult while buried under the fuselage. The old bodies of their friends that they had been feeding on were outside the fuselage, so after being buried under the snow inside the fuselage, they had to eat from the bodies of their friends who had just died in front of them in the avalanche. Secondly, when they finally emerged after 3 days from under the snow, these 8 new bodies would help them survive for a longer period. Again, it's terrifying to talk about death in this way, But this was their reality and life during that period. The plane's fuselage was partially buried under snow after they emerged. But gradually, the snow began to melt, and they started manually removing snow from the fuselage and cleaning the inside because this fuselage was like a house or shelter to them. It was the only place where they could take refuge. Being an airplane fuselage, it had insulating materials, so it at least gave them some warmth compared to their surrounding environment. Of course, some of you might ask now, why didn't they try to explore the area around them? Why did they stay in their place? At least look around or walk a bit. Maybe they would find something. The answer is that they actually tried. They tried to search for the plane's tail in particular because they thought there might be provisions or things that could help them, but these attempts always ended in failure. They couldn't move far from the fuselage for several reasons. The first and main reason was the depth of the snow. When they walked on the snow, their legs would immediately sink into it, making walking very, very difficult. Besides this, the weather was very unpredictable. Snowstorms could suddenly hit, and without proper clothes or protective equipment, advancing in any direction was very difficult and dangerous. Even their eyes would burn. They couldn't see anything because they had nothing to protect their eyes. So all their initial attempts to explore the surrounding areas were unsuccessful. They would cover short distances and then return to the fuselage. Of course, the biggest problem they faced was their legs sinking into the snow, making walking difficult. From here, they started thinking of solutions, and in situations like these, to survive, you have to start trying to innovate things and tools to help you. You have no other choice. As they say, necessity is the mother of invention. After brainstorming, they came up with the idea of using the plane seat's foam with belts to make something like snow shoes, and these shoes were actually effective for walking on snow. Their feet no longer sank easily. They reached this invention after about a month from the beginning of this ordeal. During this month, many of them came to see Nando as the leader. He was the one most determined to survive, always trying to motivate them and push them forward. By the way, he was the oldest among them, so those younger than him began to see him as a leader, and he took this role upon himself and started acting like a leader. So on that day, after trying the snow shoes and feeling they would actually allow them to move longer distances, Nando and two of his friends named Roberto and Antonio began a new exploratory journey. They chose a day when they felt the weather was somewhat clear and the sun was shining, and began moving. The plan was to try to get as far from the plane as possible and return on the same day. It was like an experiment. They kept walking down the valley, and after climbing a relatively small hill, they saw the plane's tail from afar. The tail had flown to this location after the plane crash, so they immediately headed toward it to explore inside. Inside the tail, they found some bags and began searching for any food they could find, but all they found was just a small chocolate bar. At least the change was good from the food they had become accustomed to. Among the things they found was also the camera. This camera with which they would take photos documenting their survival journey in these mountains. Among the things they found were also batteries, 24-volt batteries that were fixed in the plane's tail, meaning they were part of the plane. Here an idea occurred to them. Remember when they initially tried to use the plane's radio to communicate with any possible party? They thought maybe the radio's battery was broken, so maybe they could use these batteries to operate the plane's radio again. Don't confuse between the plane's radio used for communication and the small radio they had for listening to news and radio stations. This is just for clarification. To find the tail, Nando and his friends had covered a greater distance than they had planned for, and they felt time was running late, so they decided to spend that night in the plane's tail. The next morning, after sunrise, they returned with their findings to their friends who were waiting for them at the plane's head. After they returned with the battery, they began trying to connect it to the plane's radio. This is a real photo of them trying to connect the battery, taken with the camera they found in the plane's tail. This person named Roy Harley was the one who had some experience with radio devices. He wasn't a specialist, but because he knew a little about these matters, they appointed him as their radio expert. But the matter was complicated, especially since they had no knowledge of these things. There were hundreds of wires everywhere, so how could they connect these wires to the battery and make the radio work? It was almost impossible without real knowledge of these matters. Unfortunately, despite putting in much effort and many attempts with the radio. It didn't work for them, and this crushed them and made them feel more despair. Nando, although broken himself, tried to instill some hope in them. He would tell them that as long as they were alive, they must not despair and must keep trying to think of a way to survive. Nando was also behind the idea of using the camera to document their survival journey with photos. He would tell them that even if they didn't survive, maybe after a few years or even 100 years, someone might find the plane wreckage and find these photos, and they would know that they remained alive. Days and weeks continued to pass, and approximately 2 months had passed since the crash. Of course, among the 19 remaining survivors, some were injured. Some had been injured from the moment of the initial crash, and the suffering increased with the days, and survival was becoming harder and harder for them. 3 of them died during that month, reducing the number of survivors from 19 to 16 people. So from the 45 who were aboard this plane, only 16 remained. Most of the bodies of those who died were eaten by the living, and only a few bodies remained. Among these remaining bodies were Nando's mother and sister. Since Nando was still alive, no one wanted to touch his mother and sister. At least they would leave them for last. Nando would always tell his close friend Roberto that they had to get out of this place. How long would they stay standing in the same spot? Of course, all directions around them were frightening. They were in the middle of a vast ocean and didn't know what lay at its end. The plane fuselage was like a small boat protecting them from this ocean, so leaving the boat was something frightening. This is what prevented them from moving from their place. They were afraid that any attempt to leave this place would mean certain death, but after more than 2 months passed without any new hope, their only option was to move from their location. Of course, everyone was terrified of this prospect. It was literally like throwing yourself into the ocean. They had no idea where they would end up. Their only assumption was that they were currently on the western side of the Andes Mountains because, if you remember, before the co-pilot died, he had told them they had passed the city of Curacao, which is on the western Chilean side. They believed they were in the area you see before you, but in reality, they were closer to the eastern side. They had always thought that if they moved from their current location, they needed to head west since it was closer to civilization and cities, even though in reality, the east was closer. On the western side, there was actually a high mountain in front of them, while to the east there was a valley. Going down into the valley would have been easier than climbing the mountain, but they were convinced that if they headed east, they would encounter higher and more difficult mountains because they thought the east was far from them while the west was close. This is what they believed because they didn't know their true location. They didn't know that if they had headed east, they would have found a hotel approximately 20 kilometers from their position, with no high or towering mountains between them and this hotel. The only obstacle would have been a river, which would indeed have been difficult to cross, but if they had reached the river near the hotel, they would likely have been able to call for help from the people on the other bank who were staying at the hotel. These images and photos before you are recent pictures of the remains of the hotel that was there then. The hotel is now abandoned, but was operational in 1972. So heading east was probably their best option. The journey would still have been difficult and long, but if they had known all this information, it would undoubtedly have been their best choice. However, because they believed they were on the western side, they were always convinced that if they moved from this spot, they would head west as this was their best option. Nando was ready to leave this place at any cost, but the rest of the group kept postponing because they were afraid and hesitant. Whenever Nando tried to convince them, their response was that this wasn't the right moment, the weather wasn't suitable, or let's wait a bit longer. It was clear that fear had taken hold of them. Nando knew he couldn't leave alone, so he kept trying to convince them, or at least some of them, to come with him. Most of them encouraged him to undertake this journey, but they weren't willing to go with him. Each one would tell him, "Yes, I agree with you. Someone needs to go out and try to get help, but brother, I can't do it." They supported him, but no one volunteered to take the risk with him. Even his close friend Roberto was hesitant. This was his closest friend who had gone with him when they found the pilot. But after Nando's persistent persuasion, Roberto finally agreed. The third person Nando convinced to come with them was Antonio. He was also one of the 3 who had gone with them when they found the pilot, and he was the most athletic among them, making him a natural choice for this journey. So the same three who had gone out and found the pilot would now embark on a journey in search of new hope. This would be a journey of no return. Either they would reach safety or die trying. Of course, they had to make all their preparations, and the rest of the group helped despite their fear and reluctance to participate in this journey. They provided all possible support. First, they allocated a larger share of food to these three, enough to last several days, even though food was already scarce. Second, they would need something to protect themselves from the night cold, as it would be impossible to survive in these mountains without protection. Here, one of the group members named Carlito came up with the best possible idea. He collected insulating materials from inside the plane's fuselage and stitched them together using electrical wires to make something like a sleeping bag. It was a large sleeping bag that could fit all three of them and was very durable. Several of them took turns stitching it, and the stitching process alone took several days. After preparing all their supplies and primitive tools, the trio Nando, Roberto, and Antonio bid farewell to their friends and set out on their difficult journey on December 12, 1972. Nando's last words to his friends at the plane were that if they ran out of food and needed to consume his mother's and sister's bodies, he gave them permission to do so. The three then headed west, and immediately in front of them was a large mountain. They believed this mountain would be their biggest obstacle, and they also thought that once they reached its peak, they would be able to see the green valleys and cities or villages on the Chilean side below. They knew that climbing this mountain alone would take at least a full day. They began climbing the mountain, and naturally, it was an extremely strenuous and exhausting process. Climbing at this angle was very difficult, and moreover, they had no previous experience or practice in mountain climbing. At these altitudes, even breathing was difficult because of the reduced oxygen in the air. The more they moved and exerted effort, the more oxygen they needed, but due to the lack of oxygen, breathing became harder and harder. With every step they took, they constantly faced the risk of slipping trying to hold on but unable to maintain their grip, with each step forward resulting in half a step back. They then tried climbing the rocky sections, which itself required tremendous strength and high fitness. Rocks would sometimes fall on them. Perhaps what helped them was that they had lost a significant amount of weight. Each of them had lost approximately 30 or 40 kilos. Finally, after all their efforts, they reached what they thought was the summit. However, the peak before them was what they call a false summit, one that appears from below to be the mountain's peak. But when you reach it, you discover it's false, and there's a higher peak ahead that you must climb to reach. This discovery shattered their morale when they reached this false summit, but at least this spot was suitable for spending the night. That night, they slept pressed against each other, using the sleeping bag their friends had made for them. The cold was extremely severe, but at least the bag enabled them to survive. The next day, the three continued their arduous climbing journey. Their friends down at the plane wreckage could still see them. They appeared as tiny dots from afar, but were still within their field of vision. After the three climbed higher up the mountain, Roberto noticed something in the distance that looked like a street or road, but it was on the eastern side, the opposite direction from where they were heading. He pointed it out to his companions and asked them if that didn't look like a road. Nando said he couldn't see any road, and Antonio similarly said he wasn't sure, but Roberto insisted it was a road and even began arguing with Nando, suggesting they should descend from the mountain and head toward this road in the eastern direction. Of course, Nando flatly refused this, saying, "We climbed all this distance just to go back down." What Roberto had actually seen was indeed a road that people used, but it was on the eastern side, and they could have reached it if they had headed east. However, it was now far from them, and they still believed they were closer to the western side, so they decided to continue their journey westward and keep climbing the mountain. The climbing was extremely exhausting and took much longer than they had calculated. They thought they would need one day to reach the summit, but because of the false peak, and because the path was more difficult than they imagined, it took 3 days. The hope that kept driving them toward the summit was that they would see green valleys and villages or cities on the western side. This was always their hope, that when they reached the summit they would see these things. But the great shock came when they finally reached the summit and saw snow-covered mountains extending as far as the eye could see. There were no fields, no green valleys, no cities, no villages, no signs of life at all. The despair they felt at that moment was indescribable. After all this effort and all this hardship, the result was nothing. Nando, despite feeling all these feelings of despair at that moment, turned to his friend Roberto and said, "Let's continue. Whatever happens, happens. Either we reach safety or die trying." Roberto, although at that moment he was at the peak of despair, when he saw Nando talking this way, felt energy return to him again and said, "By God, you're right, my friend. We've come this far, so let's continue. Whatever happens, happens. Either we live together or die together." At this point, Nando made a decision, feeling that being three was slowing down their movements, and moreover, their provisions and food had decreased significantly. Nando turned to their third companion, Antonio, and said, "Antonio, you go back. Give us what's left of your provisions and food and return to the plane. Roberto and I will continue alone." Antonio agreed, gave them his remaining provisions, and started descending the mountain. Of course, descending was easier and perhaps 1,000 times faster. It might only take him a few hours. When Antonio descended from the mountain, naturally their friends at the plane saw him and went to him. He told them what had happened, how after climbing to the mountain's peak, they saw only mountains extending as far as the eye could see. He told them that Nando and Roberto had taken his remaining provisions and decided to continue the journey alone, and nothing would stop them except death. Nando and Roberto continued walking westward. They descended from the mountain they were on top of, but from the other side. At the bottom of the mountain, there was a single path extending between the mountains, and they decided this would be their route. The mountains around them were towering, but fortunately this time, they didn't have to climb any of these mountains. They tried to follow the paths and valleys between these mountains. Sometimes they had to climb some hills or small peaks, but they didn't have to climb any high mountain like the first one. From the size of these mountains around them and the vastness of the space they were in, it was difficult for them to sense distance. They had no sense of the distance they had covered or would cover, and perhaps this was a blessing in itself, because if they had been able to calculate the distance, they might have felt despair. All that occupied their thoughts and minds at that time was moving forward, and just that, and this certainly helped them psychologically. This arduous journey between the mountains continued for 10 days from the time they left their friends at the plane. But finally, after these 10 days, they reached what was for them the line of salvation, the line where the snow ended and life began. This moment was like a new life for them. The joy and happiness they felt is impossible to describe. They began walking in the green valleys they had dreamed of 10 days ago. Finally, they felt they had truly returned to life. They even saw a cow on their path, so they told themselves that there must be humans somewhere near them. They were still in the wilderness and nature, hadn't seen humans yet, but they felt they were finally getting close. They started seeing trees, grass, flowers, and even water. Nando and Roberto say that in those moments, they felt like they had entered a 5-star hotel. The weather was nice, there was water, and they even had grass to eat. They felt these simple things that we don't appreciate as blessings in our daily lives were like the greatest things in the world. During these 10 days, Nando and Roberto had covered more than 60 kilometers until they reached where they were now. But even after reaching these green valleys, they spent one last night in the open. The next morning, they continued their path and reached a river. The surprise was that there was a man on horseback on the opposite bank. They started shouting at him and signaling to him. Communication between them was difficult because the river separating them was quite large, and the sound of the rushing water was loud, so they couldn't hear each other. Of course, the man on the horse was himself surprised at how these people had reached these mountains, because they were still considered to be in the mountains even though they had descended quite a distance. Nando and Roberto had no choice about swimming across the river because the river's water would sweep them away with its force. The man on the other bank had an idea. He took a paper and pen, tied them to a rock, and threw them across to Nando and Roberto's side. Nando took the paper and pen and immediately began writing him a message explaining their situation. This is an actual photo of the message Nando wrote. He had written, "We come from a plane that crashed between the mountains. We are from Uruguay. We have been walking for 10 days, and at the plane wreckage, there are still 14 injured people waiting for rescue. We have no food or provisions, and we need help as soon as possible. Please help us. We can't even walk." Nando threw the message to the man on the other bank, and signs of shock were clear on the man's face as he read what was written. After reading it carefully 2 or 3 times, he signaled to Nando that he understood the situation and indicated that they should stay where they were and that he would bring them help. Before leaving, he took a piece of bread and cheese and threw them toward Nando and Roberto. This bread and cheese was the first food other than human flesh they had tasted during the past 2 months. The man on horseback took many hours before he could bring help because the place where they were was still far from civilization and cities. It took about 10 hours just for the man to get the news to the authorities and police. But finally, this man returned with several soldiers and military personnel, and these soldiers were able to rescue Nando and Roberto. These images before you are actual footage of the moment of their rescue and when they were first found. Their condition was miserable, of course, and their appearance showed the exhaustion and suffering they had endured. These footage and photos were taken by journalists who immediately followed the military. When they got the news, suddenly journalists appeared out of nowhere on top of these mountains. In this photo, we see Roberto on the right and Nando on the left, and in the middle is the man who was on horseback, who we could consider their savior, whose name was Sergio Catalan. Imagine, the journalists didn't even give them time to breathe, they immediately started interviewing them. One journalist even asked them how they survived all this time and what they ate. Roberto was about to answer, but Nando intervened and told the journalist they wouldn't answer that question. The journalists, honestly, weren't considerate at all. These two had literally just emerged from hell. They should have let them rest a bit and should have focused on rescuing the remaining survivors at the plane. The soldiers and security forces tried to learn from Nando and Roberto the location of their friends. They brought them a map to try to determine their location. Nando had awareness of the location because throughout these 10 days they spent walking between the mountains, he had stayed focused on the directions they were walking in, knowing he needed to remember the location to return for the others later and rescue them. Nando pointed to them the location where he thought the plane was. The group told him this location was on the Argentinian side. On the eastern side of the mountains, it was impossible they had walked all this distance. Nando told them, "By God, I don't know if we're in Argentina or not, but I'm almost certain this is the plane's location." Of course, the distance that Nando and Roberto had covered walking between the mountains was insane, about 60 kilometers. The authorities and police couldn't comprehend how 2 people in such weakness and emaciation could cover all this distance, so they were skeptical of the location. But Nando kept insisting this was the spot. Their friends who remained at the plane had spent all these past 10 days waiting nervously, and some had even lost hope and thought Nando and Roberto had died on the way. But at the same time, they were following the news on the radio, and you can't imagine their joy when they heard on the radio the news that Nando and Roberto, 2 survivors from Flight 571, had been found. Their joy was indescribable. They knew they would finally be rescued. I mean, by God, imagine their feeling at that moment. I'm sure it was the best feeling they had felt in their entire lives, like they were born again. They started hugging each other, and all the world's joy couldn't contain their happiness. The authorities and police called in helicopter aircraft to begin the rescue operation. Once again, the helicopter pilots asked Nando about the location, and Nando pointed to them the same location on the map, but the pilot told him, "Look, it will be difficult for me to find them alone. I need you to come with me." Even though Nando was surely exhausted at that moment, he said, "Okay, I'll come." So Nando boarded one of the helicopters and started flying with them as they tried to track the path they had come from. The good thing was that the weather that day was relatively clear, but despite this, flying at these high altitudes was difficult for helicopters, and the aircraft was shaking frighteningly. Thank God they didn't have an accident and crash between the mountains again. Imagine the tragedy if that had happened. But finally, the helicopters passed over the high mountain in front of them. This was the same first mountain that Nando and Roberto had climbed. Nando kept pointing down, saying the plane's fuselage was below them. The fuselage was white, and everything was white on white, so it was actually impossible to see, even though the aircraft were close to the location. Here we understand why the search attempts for them had failed. Even though there were planes flying in the areas above them, seeing them was almost impossible. Even Nando and the helicopter pilots couldn't see the plane's fuselage and the remaining survivors, until they descended to a very close altitude. If Nando hadn't known the location, terrain, and this specific spot, it would have been impossible to find it. The helicopters landed at the plane wreckage site, and finally they saw the rest of the group below, waving to them and jumping with joy. This is an actual photo taken from a camera on the helicopter at the moment they finally found them. Here we also see actual video footage of the plane wreckage. All of Nando's 14 friends who remained at the wreckage were rescued. I'm sure none of them will forget that day, which was December 22, 1972, the day of rescue. And glory be to God, the number of days they spent from the day of the crash until they were rescued is the same as the year they were in, 72 days from the moment of the crash. The remaining 14 survivors, along with Nando, were brought to safety. Their condition was very poor. Of course, each of them had lost 30 to 40 kilos of their weight, but joy was on their faces. Afterward, their names were announced on the radio so their families would know who had survived. Shortly after, they met with their families and were reunited again. News of this story spread and was covered by media around the world. It became a global story. But afterward, many articles appeared in newspapers talking about the subject of their survival by eating their friends' bodies, because this particular aspect spread and maybe was one of the reasons that made people attracted to this story. I mean, when someone hears they survived by eating their friends, they're shocked. Some of these articles even started speaking against them and calling them cannibals, and there was a big debate on this topic. Discussions started among people about whether if we were in their place, would we do the same or not. In the end, if they hadn't eaten their friends, it would have been impossible for them to survive. This story is one of the most famous survival stories that spread around the world. Books were written about it, and films and documentaries were made in huge numbers. Nando and his friends appeared in many interviews and forums and told their story with all its details. This was one of the biggest stories that was adopted by the media because of its power and strangeness, and maybe also because of its somewhat happy ending. The 16 survivors continued to meet over the years. They would have a gathering every year on the same date they were rescued, December 22. By the way, all we've said about Nando in particular, who was the undisputed leader of the journey, all these words were by the testimony of his friends. It wasn't him talking about himself and saying, "I was the leader, and I saved them, and I did." They all knew that the greatest credit after God for their survival was Nando's persistence until the last moment on survival, whatever the circumstances. Nando, who at the beginning of the crash was considered dead and remained unconscious for 3 days due to the brain injury he suffered, which his survival from was miraculous in itself. Nando and Roberto still communicate and meet with Sergio, the horseman who found them after they descended from the Andes Mountains, and their relationship with him remains strong, and they are still friends to this day. At the end of the story, it's impossible for any of us to comprehend the conditions these people lived through in the middle of those mountains. No matter how much we try to imagine and put ourselves in their place, we won't know their feelings and the psychological, mental, and physical state they were in unless we were actually in their place. So I want to end with a question for you. If you were in their place, do you think you would be able to do what they did? Would you be able to eat your friend's flesh? And with that, we've reached the end of the video. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And here are some other amazing stories you can check out. That's all for now. I'll see you in the next video. Take care.